Hey folks, welcome to the Write in the Head podcast with me, John Paul Sperling. I'm a writer and a life coach. This podcast is where we bring those two worlds together, talking about the mindset required to turn the passionate pursuit of writing into a thriving career. Coming up on today's episode. Jordan Roman has a wide range of industry experience, from being a prep technician at the Panavision rental house to working as a director's assistant at Cedar Park Entertainment. Currently, Jordan works at Netflix as a story and editorial coordinator. Jordan and I talk about the importance of taking big creative swings even as newbie writers. Jordan Roman, welcome to the show. It's been, I would say, a long time coming, having engaged with your content and chatted to you on LinkedIn. I'm really glad that we're finally doing this. How's it going today?
It's fantastic, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It is funny because I feel like we've interacted a lot online. So in a way, I feel like we know each other already, and yet this is the first time we're actually physically having a conversation.
Isn't that just the way of the world nowadays? It's meet people online and then graduate to meeting on Zoom, and then if you're lucky, graduate to meeting IRL, which is a treat, to be honest, nowadays. To see that people have a presence from here down, that's quite a treat these days.
Yeah, I even the other day I got lunch with a connection that I had solely just met through LinkedIn, and again had been engaging with just the different YouTube videos and posts I've been making. And it was so cool to actually sit face to face with a real person and talk with them, and that was really lovely. Made me realize I want to try to do that even more.
Right.
So
Isn't it funny that we now live in an age where that feels like a special occasion? What
yeah,
happened, Jordan? What happened?
I know. I think there's still I experience there's so much rollover that I think is still carrying over from the effects of COVID, from the pandemic and the lockdown. And it's interesting that even now, a couple years out, I feel like we're still feeling those effects of, seeing people in real life almost still feels a little different or unique, or, taking an interaction from online into the real world is very much still novel in a lot of ways that it never used to be prior to that. So pretty
It's
wild.
been such a big shift, and we've been talking for a long time about when does LA in particular get back to normal, because we had COVID and then we had strikes, and I think most people are fairly happy with where we are now, but it still doesn't feel what people that were living here before the pandemic, they still don't describe this as normal LA, whatever that means. And
Yeah.
I only got here December 2019, so I don't know what normal
Well,
LA even looks like. I ran straight into the pandemic, so this is my only impression of LA so far. Anyway,
yeah.
let's jump into today's discussion, because I am interested to hear your opinions on this. I've watched a lot of your content, and I think you have some really wise words to share, and oftentimes not the easiest of words to hear as screenwriters, and I really respect you for doing that. So something
Thank
we
you.
wanted to talk about today was the importance of taking bigger creative swings as writers. And I think connected to that is, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like your message might be lean away from this trend to copy other people, go with IP, sort of back away from that trend and go with just create your own thing and make it a big creative swing. Have I summed that up correctly, or am I missing something?
No, I think you're totally right. I think one of the things that I find especially important about the emphasis on creating original content that isn't based off established intellectual property or IP, that isn't based off, a comic book, a book adaptation, a sequel, a reboot, etc. Something that's truly original, taken from your own brain that you had to develop. I think part of the reason there's such a premium on this, even if the marketplace isn't necessarily putting that premium on it by making more of those, I think it's an important and essential skill set for especially up and coming creators, filmmakers, and screenwriters, because if you never learn how to actually develop the muscle to tell your own stories and develop them from the ground up, from an outline standpoint, from a structural standpoint, and just from doing the hard work to actually create that story yourself, I think that's one of the skill sets we're losing in a way, because I think the market is pushing more and more people to say, well, let's just reboot a franchise, or let's just take an idea and let's adapt it, or let's make sure that we reinvent it in some way, but let's not develop the muscles to create it on our own. And I also think this is something that is leading to a fatigue with audiences too. I think so often, I mean, me personally, I'm going to the theater, I'm seeing so many trailers, billboards, marketing for any sort of project that's based off pre-existing IP. And I think I feel exhausted. I feel like the franchises that are burned into the ground now, they all started as original ideas at some point in time, and they were rewarded for that, very handsomely. So I think that's one of the things I've been kind of a big proponent of is even if you end up still the first film you end up making as a filmmaker is an IP or a piece of IP, I think that's fine. But I think as long as you know how to develop your original voice as a storyteller in some capacity, I think that's just an extremely essential skill in today's world, especially.
Hmm. Yeah, really interesting point about losing the skill of storytelling because of all the rebooting. I'll just share a very quick story with you and then come back to that point. But I was driving along Sunset not too long ago, and I saw a billboard, and I forget the name of this, what turned out to be a TV show. But to start with, when I saw the billboard, because of the way that video games are now so advanced, I couldn't tell if it was a TV show or a video game. I recognized the name, and I'm not a gamer. If I'm sure if somebody more knowledgeable than me had seen that, they would have recognized it immediately. I recognized the name as a video game, and so I thought, is that the next sort of installment of the video game series, or is that a TV show? Genuinely couldn't tell. And
Yeah.
that's to your point about that fatigue. It's like, really? They're doing that again? Don't
Hmm.
get me wrong, I really enjoyed watching Fallout. That was a great series.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not that they're bad, it's just that there's so many of them and they just seem
Right.
to
Right.
keep appearing. So, but
Hmm.
I want to go back to actually what you said about losing the skill of storytelling. That's maybe an aspect of this I hadn't previously given much thought to. But you're right. I think if you're given an existing story to build on top of, there's a certain amount of loss in that because you're not coming up with the bare bones. You're not coming up with something from nothing. And I would say, let me know what you think about this, because I heard this said once and I loved it. Screenwriters are the only people in Hollywood that come up with something from nothing. Everybody else does an amazing job turning that script into a movie. There's miracle workers, but they're
Hmm.
working from something. A scriptwriter is the only person that starts with nothing and creates something. It's a
Hmm.
bold
Yeah.
statement, but I think there's some truth in it. And I think to your point, we might start to lose that if we just keep rebooting and basing everything on existing stories, right?
Yeah, I'd agree totally. I think that's a really good point. And I think part of the reason that, and by the way, in no way am I trying to disparage the art of adaptation because I think that is its own art form too. But I do think that when you have the bare bones, you have the soul of a story and characters that are already in front of you, it's always more possible to take that story and shape it, and there's a little bit less of the excavation of having to create your own characters and come up with the reasons why they have these backstories, or excavate a plot and why this plot would be compelling. And I just think it's harder to do that excavation work of creating your own story, world, and characters and populate it with all of the other, the narrative underpinnings. And I just think that's something that, because it's hard and because it takes longer to do, studios and a lot of the bigger studio filmmaking veers away from that because it is risky, and there's not a built-in audience already in the way that there is for pre-existing IP. So I understand that from a business standpoint, but from a purely creative standpoint, I just worry about our up and coming generation of screenwriters who are possibly not, or going to realize, oh, well, why would I take the time to develop my own story when I could just take a pre-existing piece, adapt it, and then that's my keys to the castle, which I think a lot of people are doing because they're only seeing the IP getting rewarded and getting made, except for like a small handful of probably studios that are doing original. So I think for me, that's the thing that I think is why it's not as much of a thing as it used to be. Is it's just hard and it takes longer. And I think there's also an emphasis on the speed of things getting made. And I think studios are just, and streamers, they're in such high demand of content that they just want something that can be made, developed very quickly and made without the development periods, which used to be a lot longer in the past. People don't want to take the time to develop or do 10 drafts of a script. They want to do one or two and that's it, and then go into production. And I think that's part of the reason I theorize that a lot of our movies today feel like they are soulless, or they don't have the same, life that movies in the late 90s and early 2000s did. That might just be my opinion, but I think they had heart because they took the time to revise, develop, and actually really craft these movies over a longer period of time than they do now.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how old you are, and I won't ask, but I feel like I was spoiled by growing up in I just about remember the 80s. I definitely remember the 90s. And the movies that came out in those 2 decades really set the scene for me, and I'm sure a lot of other writers. And I think there's a yearning for that type of story. And yeah, to your point, I think they are fewer and fewer these days. And some of that I think is influenced by fewer people going to the cinema, which is a whole other subject that we could talk about. But I do think there has been a dearth of this original storytelling. And something you just said, it reminded me of, this is going to sound like a very strange analogy, but I like strange analogies, so I'm going to bounce this one off of you. In a former life, I was a personal trainer and nutritionist, and one of the issues I had with clients would be that they would want to go on a program like Slimming World or Slim Fast to lose weight. And yes, you could lose weight, but it didn't actually teach you anything about nutrition.
Right.
So when you came off that plan, you would often just regain the weight because you've learned nothing about human physiology and calories and energy expenditure. So that's just what came to mind as the analogy for what we're doing with stories at the moment. We're not learning the fundamentals. So we can crank out these stories, but they're very surface level and they don't actually teach anything about the story creating process. Now that I've said that, I'm actually quite proud of that analogy. That was quite good.
Yeah, no, I think it's a perfect way of saying it, because it's like, if you learn, it's almost like, okay, you learn the mechanism, but you don't learn you learn the machine and how to operate it, but you don't know how the machine actually functions and works. And to me, my philosophy on filmmaking has always been that I would rather know not only how to operate the machine, but how the machine works down to, the smallest cog, so that I just kind of know how I can work with it. I can upend it if I need to, and I can understand why I'm doing that, and how that could break, but how it could also be put back together is another analogy to play off that.
It's the analogy. It's the difference between being a driver and being a mechanic.
Yeah, 100%. And I think for me, one of the things I've noticed too, especially when it comes to directing and screenwriting, is when I'm directing, especially if it's something that I haven't written, which oftentimes it is something I've written, it's so helpful if you're kind of looking at a scene and why it's not working on the day. And so often it's script related. Honestly, it's not necessarily that you don't have great lights, a great camera, talented actors, a crew who knows what to do, or what to tell them to do as the director. It's more that there's something that's not working on a fundamental story or character level. And I still firmly believe that no amount of spectacle, visual effects, stunts, etc., will ever usurp the value of incredible character and story that we're always going to care about long after the movie ends. Before we really celebrate those visuals, we're always going to care more about what was the human element, why did we want to watch those people, why did we care about their plight, and what did it say about life, and how can I relate to it. And it's funny, just watching a lot of movies in the last couple of weeks, I've found that from the most intensely awesome spectacle movies down to like the smallest budget, a lot of the ones I've been liking more are the ones that are much more simple and focus on the story and characters, even if they don't have any visual effects or very minimal. So that
Yeah.
just hit me even harder in the last week of story, character, script are absolutely king. And I think
Hmm.
that's why, like what you were saying earlier with, the script being the blueprint for everybody else when you're actually going into production, if that blueprint is not rock solid, and to use the metaphor of architecture, if your blueprint for the house isn't solid, then something in the house is going to have some kind of, a leak, or the foundation isn't solid. So you're going to have some kind of issue with the structure. The house is going to cave in somewhere. And that's what I think we would call plot holes, right? Where people go, yeah, but that doesn't make sense, that whatever. And it's because your foundation from the blueprint wasn't totally solid, and it could have been. And I think
Mm.
that's
Hmm.
the biggest issue
Yeah.
is we rush these things so far into production quickly. We don't make sure that the foundation we're building the house on is actually solid first.
For sure. Yeah. There's another crazy analogy that I'll bring here. I'm going to go way off on a tangent here, but I'll bring it back. Bruce Lee, I think, once said that if you hold a knife in a fight, you're at a disadvantage because you will always favor the hand with the knife, and so your opponent knows more about what you would do next. I feel the same way about special effects. It used to be they would write a good story and then think, where could we put in a few special effects to help tell the story? Now special effects has become the knife. It's become the thing they start with. And
Hmm.
so it's too predictable. It's like, I know what you're about to do. You're about to show me this
Right.
massive world that's CGI, and then you're going to sprinkle in a bit of story. So it's like,
Exactly.
it's the
Right.
thing that used to be the icing on the cake has
Hmm.
now become the thing they start with. So they haven't learned,
Right.
go back to the analogy, they haven't learned the actual kung fu. They've just gone, let's grab a knife. And
Right.
it's
For
just
sure.
not working as well as, going
Yeah.
back to the movies in the 90s, amazing stories, and if there was a few scenes where they thought, what could we do visually here, then layer something in.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think a really good example is the difference between the Lord of the Rings movies and the Hobbit movies. I mean, I don't mean to disparage the Hobbit movies or anyone who likes those. I just think when you look at both, which one has more heart and soul, which one will stand the test of time, which one do people rewatch? And
That's
in
such a
my
good
book,
point.
it's the
Yeah, I've
original
never
three.
rewatched the Hobbit movies.
Same. I mean, I've only seen them when they're on in the gym, but the
Hmm.
ones that I choose to rewatch are the original three because more and
Yeah.
more of it is realistically done. I think they just really they put a focus on the intimacy of the characters, and even though that movie's so big, it also feels so intimate at the same time. Someone else said that, and I think they nailed it when they said that.
I think we could say the Hobbit movies came up short.
Yeah, and I
Terrible,
did
terrible
say,
joke. I'm sorry, it's awful.
yeah. Nice. I didn't even get that till now. So
It's all right, we'll edit it to make it look like you did get it. It's okay.
yeah, yeah, I love it. Just edit the laugh.
I'm gonna edit that so you laugh after everything I say. Actually,
That's perfect. I love
I'm
it.
gonna look hilarious. No,
Yeah, the power of editing.
yeah, yeah. It was a 70-minute interview of you just laughing
Yeah.
continuously. I want to ask you about something that I've heard you say. I think I've heard you say this in your content, or definitely in your messages to me. There's this desire to be an innovative screenwriter or an innovative filmmaker, and I love the terminology. Could you define that for the listeners? What does that mean in your world? What does that look like to you?
I think being an innovative filmmaker or screenwriter, to me, it really means that you are willing to take massive risks with your work. And I think really what that means is you're willing to wade into a pool that has been previously completely unswam before. I think it's having the courage to say, hey, we have never tried this technique before. We've never tried maybe telling a story this way, or maybe inverting structure in a certain way. And knowing that there's the possibility it could completely fail. And I think having the willingness to accept that it could fail, doing it anyway, and thinking outside the box and pushing the envelope, to me, is what defines my favorite films and filmmakers that I look up to, and I think are a lot of the people who got me into wanting to make films when I was younger, people like James Cameron or, the Wachowskis with The Matrix. I mean, I think The Matrix is a great example of innovative filmmaking because at that point in time, when they were making that film, a lot of those visual effects techniques and the way they captured action on screen in live action that was the first time I think it had ever been
Hmm.
captured like that. And it
Yeah, the
really
whole bullet
redefined
time thing.
bullet time exactly. I
Hmm.
mean, they redefined a whole generation of how all action movies were shot after that.
Yeah,
So to
yeah.
me, that's a really great example of innovative filmmaking. And I mean, it also was a different time because it was, 1999, 2000. And I do think, thankfully, the production allowed them the time to do that R&R to develop, the research and development phase of that film was quite extensive. They allowed them the chance to develop that technology, which that movie would not have been possible had they not have been given that runway, in a way that a lot of movies wouldn't get the runway timing wise to do now what they did, and that's why I think another thing I want to point out about a film like The Matrix is I definitely also want to be clear that I never want to be in a position to disparage VFX. I do think there is an overusage of it as a crutch to mask storytelling ineffectiveness. But I think when it's used well, kind of like what you were saying, to support an already great story, that character and story have already been developed well, and it's used as a way to support that story like they do in The Matrix. That to me is when VFX and stunts are at their absolute best. So I do want to be clear that I'm a personal lover of visual effects and spectacle, but if you're doing it because your story isn't good and you didn't develop your story before you throw that in, I think the viewer is never going to care about that movie as much as they did if you brought us in with the story and character first.
Absolutely, yeah. And The Matrix was built on an exceptionally well-told story. There's
Hmm. Hmm.
anybody who denies that has missed the entire point of that movie. So
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
agree. I think the visual effects can be a stunning addition. I mean, who doesn't remember the first time they saw The Matrix? They saw Neo
Hmm.
and Mr. Anderson going like
Yeah.
flying through the air, pausing to
Amazing.
do a 360.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. Uh-huh.
never seen anything like that. And what's hilarious about that is probably less than a year later, Scary Movie 3 was parodying that scene.
Uh-huh.
That just shows you
Yeah.
how fast the technology evolved once they'd proved
Yeah.
it could be done.
Yeah, it's very true, right? And then I mean, there was a nod to it in Shrek, which I
Yeah.
actually thought was
Yep.
fun, it's because they were clearly like, tongue in cheek pointing to, this movie that had such an impact and
Yeah.
I think
I love it
celebrating.
with with Shrek as well. It's like we could have done this at any point because this is
Yeah.
animated. So
Yeah, right. And I think like with Shrek, it's so fun because that is an incredible story in its own right too. An incredible achievement in the world of 3D animation.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
I love that they were like, hey, we see what you're doing and it's an homage. So
Yeah. And we have to respect that because it was
mhm.
like you said, tongue in cheek, nothing wrong with that. But yeah, just the fact that it was so breakthrough in the Matrix, and then everybody else just copied it for fun. It was, and I think
Yeah,
that does go back to the point you made about it's probably more difficult in some ways to be innovative today because so much has already been done, right? So what
yeah,
are we
that's
going to do
true.
next? I
Yeah.
think innovation now looks like it doesn't look as different because we've taken a lot of the bigger steps with visual effects.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
if you
Uh-huh.
look at the innovation used for something like Thor, Love and Thunder,
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
is different to how they did even earlier MCU movies. But visually, I think you'd have to be quite astute to really notice those differences.
Hmm.
Most of the differences come
Definitely.
in the production process. So
Definitely.
it's
Yeah.
it's tricky now, isn't it? Because so much has already been done, and I guess the next iteration
Yeah.
would be who's going to
Mhm.
get ahead with VR or something
Yeah.
similar to that. I think that's the next evolution.
For sure. I think you're right that it's incredibly difficult now to be innovative, by the year, especially with how rapidly technology is evolving and, AI and how incredibly sophisticated it got so quickly. I think for me the interesting thing to consider is I think to a lot of filmmakers, what innovative would look like in today's climate is, more usage of VFX or even bigger VFX or more lifelike VFX. And to me, I actually think what's more interesting, just because I don't see a lot of filmmakers going this direction, is getting creative in ways and innovating in ways where we still are targeting the human component or doing shots or telling stories and different structures that aren't as common or maybe we haven't seen before. And to be honest, I don't know exactly what that looks like right at this moment, but to me, I'm more interested in how can we still be innovative in the human side of performance, writing, and structure. And if there's ways that that can still be excavated, that to me again could be a big failure, but it could pay off in such an interesting way that's not just relying on VFX. And I think studios so often think that, the next step is bigger VFX, even more lifelike, doing like reconstructing people's faces and, doing AI recreation on, people to look like people who are not around anymore. I think that's seen as like the next step. But to me, I'm more interested personally in what is creativity that you could do right now look like that focuses again still more on the narratively structured side of things, the dramatic structure side of things, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
And it makes perfect sense. And even down to the editing, where is the next cut coming that we're not expecting? And
Right,
how is
right.
that being used to tell the story? I saw the Iron Claw, I think it's called,
Oh yeah,
recently. Some
amazing.
moments in that movie that I don't think I've ever seen a movie cut together like that, just to miss out what you would think are very important scenes, but still
Mhm,
communicate exactly
mhm,
what
mhm.
happened. The guy, I forget the character name now, I apologize, but riding his motorbike late at night, he's angry about something.
Oh
The
yeah,
next
uh-huh,
scene,
uh-huh.
he's getting out of bed, scratches on his back, grabs his
Yeah.
crutches, half his leg is missing.
Oh my gosh, yeah,
You
yeah. I
know, you,
remember
you
that
don't
scene
see
now.
anything actually happen, but you don't need
Right.
to. You join the dots, you understand the story. That
Hmm.
was revelatory for me as a writer and as somebody that is interested in directing. I would say that's a fair way of describing it. I
Yeah,
immediately I
absolutely.
immediately wanted to go home and rewrite my scripts and get rid of half
Yeah,
of the scenes. Like, oh,
for
turns out you
sure.
don't
Yeah.
need to actually see everything happening.
Oh, for sure. I think sometimes it always goes back to that what you're not showing, it can always be more interesting than what you are. And I think that's where a lot of horror films go wrong. I think that's where a lot of big budgeted films show their hand is they show too much of the CGI, they show too much of the monster. I think we really like the idea of letting our imagination still be an active participant in the watching experience. I think like Jaws, the shark wasn't working, so they're like, well, let's just show part of it, and that always ended up being scarier because what you don't see underwater is the unknown monster under the bed, if you will. So I personally think that that is such a smart way of filmmaking. I think smart filmmakers understand the psychology of what you're not showing. As long as people are already on board for the ride, if you already got them, then you can elide a lot of things with editing and people will understand. And I think that also goes to the concept of treating your viewers as smart people and having the faith that they will understand the language of cinema. You don't have to spell out every single line for them, and they will understand what's happening, and they will actually appreciate that you treated them, with the respect of someone who can put two and two together. And I think that's why, people like Jordan Peele, he said this a lot in interviews. His films and his scripts are so great, and he's one of the few people doing original films with bigger and bigger budgets, which is amazing. It almost feels like a novelty in today's filmmaking culture to see original movies with budget's over, $10 million, 10, $20 million. So, you
Yeah,
know,
and I do want to ask you about that because I love what you're saying about take big creative swings and write something that's true to you and don't think too much about IP. The question is there still a way into the industry for screenwriters taking that approach? It is so tough at the moment. Can you still, in your opinion, and obviously none of us know this for sure, but in your opinion, can you still break into the industry as a relatively new screenwriter with one, let's say, one really, really good original script?
I think you can, though I agree with you. I think it is tremendously harder in 2024 breaking in with an original script, especially if you're not established. It is very, very difficult, but I think it's possible still. I think usually the keys there would be if you can at least get one piece of established talent on board who believes in your project, or one producer exec who just really believes in it. But I do think it's not a bad idea to have at least a sample or two that is maybe an adaptation or is based off something. I do think that having at least one of those in your quiver is smart as an up and coming screenwriter, because that's what's getting bought right now by and large, even in the indie space. So I do think if you go into a meeting and they're like, well, we don't want anything original. And I've been in those meetings. They're like, well, cool idea, but we're not looking for originals right now. And you're like, really? And it's
Could you not have
trust.
told me that before the meeting? Could you?
Oh, it's the most disheartening thing. But then they're like, well, what else do you got? And if you have something that is at least established in some other way, it's almost like immediately that they're like, oh, cool, what's that? What's the audience? Blah blah blah. Like they're
Mm,
starting to run the numbers of like how much of a fan base is there. So I think it's smart to have at least one sample of and one idea of both. And I think it's still important to develop the original. So you're still developing those original storytelling muscles, kind of like we were talking about, but also to give yourself a better chance of breaking in today's climate, which again, it could change next year or then the year after that. But I think sometimes it's really important to just look at the market and say, if I want to break in now, what do I have to do? And I do think there's nothing wrong with doing something that's not original if it allows you to get into the game now, and then you can broker, bigger projects later to eventually do something original. I think that's just what a lot of filmmakers are having to do right now. The only real studio that I see that's doing truly original films, as far as I'm aware, is A24. I can't name another one that's doing like every single one's original. I'm pretty sure every single project they've done is not based off something else that I'm aware of. I could be wrong on that, but it's just refreshing to see that some of those original stories are still doing really well, and Everything Everywhere winning Best Picture was refreshing. And I don't know if the studios are learning anything from that, but if they were paying attention, I think they should, because that movie was truly original. And it was not only original in the script, but the way it was made was original. And that is another modern day example of when I talk about like an innovative film. I think that was a perfect example of a modern innovative film that told a story in such a unique way, used VFX in such a smart way, but it never was usurping, that we cared about Michelle Yeoh, her daughter, all the characters in that story first and foremost.
yeah. And that kind of takes me to the next question that I'd love to ask you, because I've noticed that you are particularly interested in stories that really focus on human vulnerability. And like you were
Yeah.
saying, okay, go ahead and add some special effects if you feel the need, but there has to be that central story of a human being, and that is obviously the thing that we all connect to the strongest. Do you
Mhm.
think that that is still the place for screenwriters to get started? Because that's how I got started, was to focus on story, not think too big budget, not think too much about who might be attached to this, and I've learned to do a bit more of those things during the creation process with the more scripts I've written. But to start with, it was just write a human focused piece. Is that still good advice?
I think so. I mean, I really think if you can, if you're starting your career as a newer writer, I think that's one of the best ways to really learn how to tell contained stories first and foremost, because a lot of times those are character driven stories that have to have the performances and the characters be interesting because they're character driven versus, plot or effects driven. So I think those are really good ways to hone your skills as a writer, because oftentimes when you're starting writing too, you want to write to a lower budget. That's something you could actually produce, or especially like class projects where you don't have a lot. So you shouldn't write a big spectacle scene. You should write maybe two people in a room talking. And I think that's such a good way to test your writing and your filmmaking ability, because if you can keep that interesting with two people in a room and everybody is riveted, they're not going to care that there wasn't any location changes or any effects or stunts. And again, it'll be cheap to produce. And so I think starting that way with the human centric story that's character driven, that's a good muscle to exercise. Is, can I write a protagonist that actually undergoes a progression from A to B? Can I write supporting characters that are interesting and add to the story, not subtract, and are not just like window dressings, if you will. I think that's a big issue we see in a lot of larger films. Is you have a big actor you throw in there for the marketing, they're not adding much to the story. Their character we never really explore, and we feel like it's a missed opportunity. I think that's the smart way, is to learn how to write character driven stories, because then you'll really learn how to write great characters. And then once you scale up, then you'll be able to add in the visual effects, the stunts, et cetera, et cetera. But you'll know how to write characters well first. And then scaling up is just a matter of, now you write in this scene with like a fight or whatever it is. But if your characters are already well worked out, now you can start to bring in the character development into those set pieces. Like I've heard this described by, I think it was the podcast that said, when they're writing characters into an action scene, you also want to write how your character would actually do in the fight based off like their character. Like they shouldn't be this kind of, would say, wimpy person, and they go into a fight and they're incredible at fighting, and all of a sudden they're agile, and then they go back to being it's like, wait a minute, that's out of character. I mean, the scene's cool, but it doesn't, you know what I mean? So I think it allows you to actually tie it all together more cohesively, and you kind of realize that your effects can also tie into character moments too, and your effects can almost kind of support character development and or lack thereof. So yeah, I think it's the best way to go.
We're kind of saying that the effects are motivated by what's going on to the character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think just learning how to write interesting characters is such a good skill set. I mean, I think if you can write characters that people want to continue to watch and are entertained by, we're invested in, I mean, that is the absolute bedrock of drama. Like we same with like a play or, a good podcast or a good TV shows. Why do we keep listening? Why do we keep watching? It has to be because we care in some way about the characters or what they're going through or what they are facing. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think that's the best way in.
That's the challenge when it comes to writing a TV pilot. It's not it's not just a character or a group of characters that has to go beginning, middle, end over 90 to 120 minutes.
For sure, yeah.
Are we going to watch these characters for 7 seasons? That's the question.
For sure, yeah.
Daunting.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm also a huge fan of character introductions. I think there's so many great opportunities in screenwriting for when we first meet a character on screen. How are we meeting them? How can we telegraph so much info right away so that, especially in a feature where you don't have as much time to establish your story as TV, we need to know quickly who is this character, what are they about? Can you visually storytell and use narrative economy to truncate a lot more of what dialogue could say into like a couple frames? That to me is also a reason that writing and developing your storytelling voice as a writer with original material is so important. It's those little nuances that you learn to develop instead of seeing what another great writer did. And you're like, oh, well, I'll just copy that. But you don't learn the reasons why they were doing it. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, some very good points there. I do want to ask you before we run out of time about your experience with Cuddle Buddies, the book that you have created, and it is available on Amazon, and we will link it in the description. But anybody that's written a book, I want to ask them about that process. I've done it once. It was a non-fiction book in the personal development space. So very, very different to anything entertainment based, but it was such an experience and I learned so much from doing it. So I always love to ask, I'm going to be pretentious and say fellow authors,
Yeah.
what,
Thank you.
I'm going to give us both that credit. I'm going to give us both that
Thank you.
praise and say, my fellow author, Jordan, what did you learn from that? And was there something that you sort of carried from that experience to screenwriting and filmmaking? Was there something that was transferable?
Yeah, well, I definitely, I really appreciate that, that and the fellow author status. The book it's technically kind of like a guidebook, like a textbook to essentially every step of how we made the short film Cuddle Buddies. Essentially, it all started as a series of articles that I wrote, where I detailed each stage of production to really help people understand like every nook and cranny of how did we develop the idea, how do we make it, how did we go through post, how do we get the money, etc. So in a way, it's not a traditional like fiction book. That is still absolutely something that's high on my list to do, hopefully soon. So I think you're a rung even above me on the author list. But yeah, I think writing it though, what it taught me was I care a lot about the beyond the surface level details of production, dramatic structure, writing. And I think what I learned is I actually love to explore those, whether through, my channel, talking about them verbally or on the page with the written word. I just love the details in the process of how do we create these things? How do we see them through? How do we arrive at this end product from years and years and months of probably hard work and brainstorming and conversations? Like how do you cull what's in here to that final, product? That became something I was very passionate about, just communicating about. And I think I do that a lot on my YouTube channel as well. And all in an effort to help, other filmmakers or maybe just share a process and learn from each other. But also for me, I think it's very much a way for me to unpack my brain and all that's going on in there about why do I do the things I do? Is there ways I could do it better? Does it make sense, sort of my reasoning for why I make creative decisions the way I do and how I pick ideas, how I direct them and see them through. And I think it's helped me even realize like, oh, there are things I think I do well, and there's things I think I could do better for sure. So for me, I guess it's very much an exploration period of my own psyche and why and how I create, if that makes sense. And that's, I think, doing that book with all those articles and realizing like, oh, I'd written like 100 something pages. I didn't even know it. Really helped me realize like, oh, that was all that stream of conscious actually did help me, make sense of that whole project.
Yeah, I love that. I want to just start to bring this one into close with something that I wrote down when you first reached out and suggested this subject of taking big creative swings. Something that came to mind. I'll read this to you as I'm quoting myself, and then I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Bigger swings lead to more dramatic misses most of the time, but you only need one of them to connect. Whereas smaller swings, you might still miss, and even if they do connect, you're probably not looking at a home run.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think if there's anything that I want people to come away with from either this conversation or just even my videos, I think that it's so worth it to take big creative swings and to embrace risk. It's far better to take a big swing than not take a swing at all, you know? And I think when it pays off well, it pays off extremely well. And if it doesn't, it's another chance to learn, you know? So I think too often we're afraid of failing, I'm trying to work on this too, but I think it's important to fail, and I think it's important to fail a lot. That's the only way that you actually grow, like truly grow, you know, in any sort of business or field.
Yeah, something that I heard just yesterday on a podcast I was listening to. I'll share it with you now because I think based on what you just
Hmm.
said, it might be useful to you as well. So this is on the Modern
Hmm.
Wisdom podcast hosted by Chris Williamson, and he's
Um,
interviewing Alex Hormozy. And Hormozy
okay.
has so many quotes that I love, and this one was something along the lines of, you shouldn't worry about failing because you're failing in private, essentially. Like, if you look at all the people you know that are massively successful, you don't ever hear about the 10 years they spent failing. You only get to know them when they get successful. So, unless they volunteer that information and talk to you about their backstory, at which point you already know it has a happy ending because they're now famous. So,
Right. Yeah.
no one's going to remember your failures unless you talk about them. So why are
Right.
we all so afraid of failing on this journey that we're on? I really loved how he reframed that. That was so insightful for me, and kind of one of those facepalm moments. Like, yeah, why did I not think of that? No one cares if I fail right
Yeah.
now. No one knows whether I'm failing right now, so I may
Yeah.
as well keep going for it.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that I do love that podcast. I really like Modern Wisdom. I listen to that one quite a bit as well. And I think I've for me, I've learned quite a bit about just the fact that the more you, even if you do fail and it's somewhat visible, I think the more you own those failures and you just say, "Hey, I'm trying. At least I'm trying. I am actively trying to actually grow and progress, and the only way to do that is to have some failures." I think when the moment I started realizing there was power in owning those, the more authentic I felt, but I also felt like, oh, so now I have permission to keep failing, and oftentimes I'm actually getting a lot of successes as well. Or I learned so much from that failure that now the next time I did it so much better. And I think you know, one of the biggest things I've been trying to push on my channel is I've been trying to be better more recently about admitting when I have failed or when I have done something as a filmmaker that I didn't do so well and could have gone much better. And I'm trying to kind of let the up and coming generation of filmmakers know that, yeah, it's sometimes it is so brutal, and this industry can eat you alive, and you feel at the lowest of the lows, but it's kind of part of the ride. And if you don't have those failures, then something's wrong, you know?
Nobody got to success without failing, so if you're not failing, you're not on your way to success.
Yeah, yeah, and just the freedom. I think it's the freedom to fail. You know, the same way that I like to tell my actors if they're in their head or something's not quite clicking on set. The biggest thing I try to say to them is you have permission to mess the scene up. You don't have to get the lines right. You can. It's okay if you mess up, but I want to see you commit to the
Yeah.
character,
Yeah.
and if
That's
you're
the
committing,
key.
then that
Yeah. And that
exactly.
carries over
And it's so
to
funny
any
how
discipline in this industry. It's just the commitment. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it's so funny the moment you kind of say that, they're like, oh, and it's like it usually always, I mean, everything just totally flips, and they're like, oh, okay. I think people get attached to it has to be amazing, and it has to be amazing very quickly and right away, and we just our culture is so like it's just like fast paced, and everything is such instant gratification. The word I was looking for. It's such instant gratification that if it doesn't go well in the first or two attempts, it almost is. Some people just throw it away as it's a failure instead of like stay in the game. You're going to get there, but if you fail right away and you give up, then you'll never get it. But staying in it, it's the only way to eventually achieve, and then the success feels even better. You know, so.
Yeah. There's the Winston Churchill quote: "Success is going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm." Try and remind myself of that
Yeah,
all the time.
that's awesome.
Um,
Yeah,
Dude, this has been
love
so
that.
fun. I've loved this conversation. I think you've made some extremely great points, and people can obviously find out more
Thank
about
you.
how you feel about the whole situation by following your channel. So, where can people go to
Thank
follow you, to
you.
connect with you? What links should we include in the YouTube description?
Yeah, so I have yeah, my own YouTube channel. I'll send you the link because I can't even remember what the actual number on it or something, but yeah, so I have my channel on there. Every week we have a new video coming out that we usually address some sort of filmmaking techniques, or we even just talk about the state of the industry and what I've learned. And then yeah, I'm on Instagram at Joro719, Joro719. I would say those are probably the two best places you could find me. And then I also have a website where all of my last film works are up if you want to see my portfolio of the last projects I've directed and written. So I can send you that as well. It's Ominous Entertainment, which is my production company. So
Nice. Yep, send it all over. We will include it all in the description. And until we speak again, which I'm sure will be fairly soon, take care. And again, thank you
yeah,
for your time today. This has been fantastic.
absolutely. Thanks for having me.